Thank you for spending your time with us this morning. Any Portugal fans or Moroccan fans in the audience? Hands up. Well, a special thanks to you for missing the game. I guess it's 1-0 already. Ronaldo scored in 3 minutes into the game. Thank you so much for spending your time. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the journey of digital transformation, and I'm going to focus on these 4 perspectives you see in front of you: DevOps, culture, people, and process. And looking at the size of this room, the number of people in this room, the open source movement is just gaining momentum and momentum. Like I think you said, Luke, 4 years ago we did this, we couldn't find hardly 100 people, and today we have over 500 registrations. So thank you for your time, thank you for your business, and let's keep this thing going. So today I'm going to talk about DevOps, I'm going to talk a lot about culture, and I'm going to go through a bunch of research that's been done, because I get asked all the time, how do I transform the culture within the company? How do I change processes and people within the company? And so I went through a number of research areas to look at, what is the research telling us? And it can help you, if you go through this transformation exercise, validate, justify, why you need to go through some of these changes based on real research that's been done in the field. So there's a lot of references to different works done by different types of researchers. I think Paul did a great job talking about Red Hat, who we are, why we exist, but we believe open unlocks the world's potential. That is our purpose. That is what we believe. And to extend that, if you look at using open technologies, open standards, you can start to consume some of the existing proprietary environments, like some of the public cloud providers, by laying on an open source solution and hence making it open. Keeping things open gives you options. It doesn't close any doors. So Simon Sinek, people that know Simon Sinek in the crowd? A few people. He's a thought leader, he's an author. He started with this book called Start With Why. And Simon wakes up every morning, his purpose in his life is around getting people to feel inspired to go to work, to contribute meaningful value to the organization, feel like they're making a contribution and to come home fulfilled. And I love doing these events because, although we don't know each other specifically, we know something about each other. And I think in this rapidly changing world we live in, this new digital economy that's evolving, our ability to surround ourselves with people who believe what we believe and have our values is going to be critical to the success and the survival of our groups within our organizations ourselves, and in fact the human race if you push it to that limit. When you surround yourself with people who believe what you believe, something profound happens. Trust emerges. Trust is a distinct human emotion. It's part of the limbic part of our brain. It's a feeling we get. And when you trust somebody, that is a very important quality that you have within the group that you're working in. When you have trust within your organization, you will take risks. You will experiment. And when you experiment, by definition, experimentation means failure, right? It's okay to fail, because the other people in the group have your back. This allows you to explore, allows you to innovate. Simon Sinek talks about this all the time. Start with the why. What is the purpose of your organization? What is the purpose of your group? If everybody has those same values and beliefs of what everybody's on the same page, you will build trust. And trust is one of the most important attributes we need in building a high-performance, high-trust team. So to get into DevOps, the origin of DevOps really is convergence of many different movements, philosophical and management movements. It really came out of people that were studying the automotive manufacturing lines, like Toyota and in the automotive industry, and looking at lean manufacturing, as it's called, theory of constraints. The Agile Manifesto came out in 2003. It talks about how we do Agile-based software development. Agile infrastructure, taking agile methods to implying the infrastructure in the Toyota Kata, teaching the people within the organization how to learn from the issues within the environment and issues within the organization, and practicing that over and over and over again. And these are some of the origins that came out in the 70s and the early 80s, and they applied a lot of those principles to how we look at IT. You can visualize IT as an assembly line, right? You have a business hypothesis. It goes to a developer typically. If you're developing a bespoke application, that's turned into code. It goes through the life cycle, the application life cycle, from development to the various testing to pre-prod to prod. That is an assembly line. We're a little different because the assembly line is not physical. You can't see it, right? It's invisible. And so thinking of that assembly line, as we call in DevOps, the technology value stream, that's why you can apply some of these principles to the DevOps movement. And I think some of the origins of DevOps, I think the first time really we saw this in a grandiose scale was actually here in Toronto in 2009 at the Velocity Conference, when John Allspaul and Paul Hammond from Flickr at the time got up and said to everybody in the crowd, we're doing 10 deploys a day to production, right? People were throwing up in the aisles. It was crazy. How do you secure that? Right? Who are these crazy guys? And that happened right here in Toronto. So I'm very proud of that fact as a Canadian that a lot of this movement started. Patrick Dubois, who actually coined the term DevOps and did a future conference in Belgium, actually was inspired by what John and Paul said at the Velocity Conference in 2009. So DevOps, as I said, is a movement. It's a philosophical approach to both innovation, how we organize ourselves, how we think about process. It's not just a technology problem, and Paul did a great job about talking about the technology side of things today, but technology really, at the end of the day, is the easy part. And that's when I meet executives, and they ask me, how do I transform culture? How do I get away from the waterfall method to doing innovation to a more DevOps fashion? The technology is not the hard part. It's the people and the process and the culture itself. We've also seen the emergence of security coming into the fray as well. When we think about DevOps, we think about security and the waterfall approach as something you do at the end of the project, right? Is it secure? Can we audit? Is it compliant? But we're starting to see this term DevSecOps, and the whole point of that is to make sure that everybody's not only accountable for anything that goes into production in that assembly line, that technology value stream, but everybody else is responsible for thinking in a security-based mindset. So DevSecOps, and there's some references there that you can talk about. One of the things we're trying to solve for in DevOps is this idea that Dr. Goldratt came up with during the lean manufacturing movement, saying the core chronic conflict. And this occurs in an organization where you have opposing goals, diametrically opposing goals and incentives between groups, right? And if they're not completely aligned to the global organization, you will not achieve the results that you want. In IT specifically, we talk about development and operation having diametrically opposing goals. Development, we're trying to work with the business, we're trying to do rapid change, we're trying to get new features out into production all the time, right? Versus operations, we're focused on keeping things stable, predictable, secure, and reliable. And so to get around this conflict, that's why we have this concept of shared accountability, right? Everybody in the team is responsible for whatever goes into production. If there's an issue in that assembly line, we swarm together, we solve the problem, and we get it to production. And around the organization of teams, General Stanley McChrystal came up with this book, this idea of team of teams. And you can probably see in the upper left side of the slide, the old command and control. You know, if you look at an organization, I think most of us can say, where are the decisions made? We just look at the organizational hierarchy, and we know where a lot of the strategic decisions are made, and a lot of decisions are made in that kind of structure or organization. So the traditional command and control organization. General Stanley McChrystal said, look, we need to think about making sure the entire organization understands the mission, the purpose of what the company does, or the government organization. We can no longer think of ourselves in an assembly line. We only know our part. We can no longer think about having a bureaucratic organization where we're focused on our group and our specific piece of the pie. We have to understand everything. And we have to understand what the other people are doing so that we have to create what's called a shared consciousness. We understand and are consciously aware of what the company's trying to do. And you want to merge to a situation where you have teams of teams, right? Everybody sort of has a relationship with somebody from the other team, and ideas flow virally, just like a virus flows as a metaphor, and he talks about this in the book. If an idea comes, it has to flow through all these teams in a viral fashion. And making sure that those ideas are aligned with whatever the purpose and the goal of the company is. So that's a good read. So when we look at DevOps, this is myself and Gene Kim. How many people have attended our Gene Kim events? A few people. So we've run a number of events with Gene. Gene is one of the forefathers of DevOps. He wrote the Phoenix Project. People know the Phoenix Project. He also just released the how-to book for DevOps. And he came up with these three ideas, the most general principle or high-level principles of what DevOps is. The first principle is from development to operations, again, an assembly line. from development to production, you're trying to maximize flow. Maximize flow, you have smaller pieces of work, we call it single piece. We're trying to move just a small change from development all the way through the assembly line to production. We're trying to make the work visible, right? We're trying to eliminate queues. There should be no handoffs, ideally. And that's why we bring teams together, so that we're all shared and working on the same problem. We want to make sure that at any point in that assembly line, we have no more than 3 pieces of work being worked on at the same time. That causes bottlenecks, that slows down flow. And so that's why you need to make the work visible. That's why we have things such as Kanban boards, and we do daily stand-up meetings in the Agile methodology. We're trying to maximize flow. If there's a problem during the flow, we swarm and we fix it together as a team. So that's the first major principle within DevOps, and those were some of the sub-principles I just went through under that fast flow. The second one is feedback loops. Whenever there's a problem, we need to stop everything and fix the problem right away, and we need to learn from it, and we need to share it on a global basis throughout the entire organization, of course, where it's appropriate. So feedback loops is the second major principle. I usually reference, how many times within a Toyota assembly line, how many times they pulled this thing called the Kanban cord? It's the cord that you pull whenever there's a problem. There's a missing piece. A piece doesn't fit, right? It doesn't go together well. Within a Toyota manufacturing building, they'll actually pull that cord around 3,500 times a day. Now, every time you pull it, it doesn't actually stop the assembly line. If it lasts more than 5 minutes, it will stop the assembly line. But that's how many times a day that they're saying, look, I have a problem, we need to fix it, and we need to learn from it so that it doesn't happen again. And that is, in essence, what the Toyota Kata is. We need to do the same thing in how we do our jobs. And lastly, the third major principle is around constant learning and experimentation. We need to constantly learn. We need to have the telemetry within our environment. I know Gene talks about one customer who's got over 800,000 metrics in their environment. Obviously, they don't look at all the data all the time, but when they need to isolate and understand a problem, they can find that very quickly. The other major thing with DevOps is you're always experimenting with the market. You're always trying to change the offer, and that's like one of our customers, TELUS Digital. Is there TELUS Digital people in the room today? TELUS Digital is always changing the offer to the market. They do 500 deploys per day on average to production. That may be changing a font, maybe changing how many offers per product that you're interested in, but anything you buy from TELUS Digital runs through this experimental learning process. And to look at around 1908, Yerkes Dodson came up with this relationship, the researchers around the effect of performance versus arousal. And this arousal is not the arousal you're probably thinking of, but it's around, when you're really excited and passionate about what you do, you get a natural muscle tightness, but not only that, you also get a sense of attention. You're completely focused on what you do. And getting back to that fast flow I talked about, if we have large batch sizes where you have a lot of change going through that assembly line, that can create very high arousal with very poor performance. I think we've all been there where we try to push a massive change to production and had multiple issues. We want to push smaller changes all the time to production. Versus a simple task where you get great arousal, you're passionate, you can actually see your work in production, maybe the day that you wrote the code as an example, and you complete simple tasks, and that drives much higher performance. So anxiety size equals batch size, and batch size is the amount of change that you're putting through the system. So complex and familiar and difficult leads to high amounts of arousal, but really poor performance. And that's why we're trying to maximize flow by smaller pieces of change going into production. So to lead into my next topic, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And as a strategist, it pains me to say this, but if you don't have the supporting culture around your organization, around the strategy you put in front of people, you're not going to have as much success if you do. So culture, it's really about the people and organizational cultures first and foremost. I think if we look at technology, even process, in some degrees the people, culture is the number one thing that's really driving high performance teams, and it's about getting stuff done together. And I've already talked about Red Hat unlocking the world's potential. We have a few number of beliefs. We believe in meritocracy, the best idea wins. It's based on the best case you can put forward on a decision versus, traditional organizations where you have either position, privilege, or prejudice can impact, types of decisions. Literally, with the people, the frontline workers who are innovating within the open source space are actually making major decisions on our strategy and where we're taking our products. And some of you in the room might actually be contributing to that as well. So when I talk culture, I'm not talking about a sales culture or a hippie culture or, right, or new age culture. I'm talking about culture in a professional sense, a sense where we can understand the impact of, group performance based on what the culture of the company is. And one of the fundamental definitions I've seen out there is by Dr. Robert Westroom, who is he's a doctor, but he's a medical researcher. And he says, culture is defined as the organization's pattern response to problems and opportunities it encounters. So think about yourselves. If there's a threat to your organization or if there's an opportunity, one of your competitors goes out of business, how does your group respond to that? Do you respond as a team? Do you respond as groups trying to compete to actually win the prize? How do you respond to that? And you can see he's actually focused on understanding the performance of teams and I think the ultimate outcomes that anybody in this room can have. He was studying the effect of emergency rooms in terms of how well do they perform in terms of life and death situations. The other side of innovation is written by Vijay and Chris Trimble, talking about how do you look at the rules for strategic innovators and how do you solve for these problems and execute against that to transform culture. What was interesting in this book is if you look at sort of the top 3 roles or titles within an organization that sort of drives this new DevOps movement, the number 1 title is the Director of Operations. The Director of Operations is the person that is exposed to the executives, right, and feels the pressure for delivering on projects and the global goals of the company, but they're close enough to the front lines to understand why things are not working and how they should change them and why they should change them. The second title that we see driving a lot of DevOps movements and transformations in organizations is somewhere in enterprise architecture, right? They understand at a global level what's going on and they can provide recommendations for change. And the third person is actually the Director of Application Development. Those are sort of the 3 roles, again, sort of help drive innovation within the organization and change how you innovate. So getting back to Dr. Westroom and some of his results, he's always looking at building out a safety culture. I think we all want to work in safe environments, right? Nobody likes fires in production. Nobody likes to get a call on the weekend saying the application's broken or the web service is down. And this culture that he says that is most successful is it has conscious inquiry. And it's somewhat related to what the general mentioned in his book on the team of teams. A culture where we're always asking questions. Why do we do it this way? What data can we get? Can we take the scientific approach to understanding how we work and how we innovate and learn from that? And he was also, Dr. Westroom was looking for, how do I classify cultures into different categories so I can model them and understand them and then figure out how they perform? The most critical part of an organization that dictates how you can predict how performing they're going to be is actually the flow of information, right? The flow of information throughout the organization that's aligned with the mission. And at the end of the day, the culture, which is really manifested within the organization, but it's driven by the leaders, the symbolic actions of our leaders, how they reward the organization, how they punish the organization, really drives how the culture forms within the company. And if those leaders can take a leadership role and drive conscious inquiry and make sure information is shared throughout the entire organization, you'll be successful. So by looking at the flow of information as that key cultural marker, you come up with these sort of 3 models that or patterns of cultures that he saw in organizations across the world. The first one is scenario A. This is a pathological organization. This organization is focused on information as an asset to be used for power, politics, control within the organization. Messengers are shot, responsibilities are skirked. Nobody wants to take responsibilities for anything happening within your organization. Failure is covered up, and of course, new ideas are crushed. Hopefully you don't work in a pathological organization. A bureaucratic organization, which is probably in the majority of companies and government entities across this nation, is a bureaucratic company. It's focused on rules, it's focused on the group, information stays within the group for the betterment of the group, and people focus on, this is my job, that's not my job. There's not a sense of overall accountability for the mission and goals of the company. The last scenario he calls the generative culture. Information is actively sought, right? We're gathering all this data and learning from it. Messengers are trained, responsibilities are shared. They believe in the mission and the purpose of the company. And new ideas are welcomed. So our ability of our leaders shape the culture of our companies, right? Through their symbolic actions, their rewards, their punishments. And there's good news. Leaders can shape the organization to become a generative-based organization. And if you look at this, when we talk about DevOps, or bring it back to what we're talking about, when you look at an organization where you have sharing of information all the time amongst the various groups within the organization, you'll be much more effective. You get the right information to the right person, to the appropriate person at the right time, you'll be able to adjust how you innovate. Google started a project called Project Aristotle about 2-3 years ago. It was a 2-year study. They looked at 180 teams. And they said, what makes a high-performance team? What sort of members of that team do you need to make a high-performance team? And they went with probably a lot of the assumptions I had and a lot of the assumptions you have on a team, right? They looked at, having diversity of skill to solve the problem, diversity of experience, right? A whole bunch of people with lots of letters after their names, right? PhDs, right? You put together highly intelligent people into a team. And when they went through the data, they couldn't find correlations between these sort of assumptive things that they thought comprised a high-performance team. That was not the fact at all. It wasn't based on intelligence, wasn't based on all their skills. And they actually thought, what are we doing? We really don't understand this. And they happened to come across, talking to a number of sociologists and psychologists, and they said, there's this paper written by people from MIT, Carnegie Mellon, that you see at the bottom of the slide. And what they found was this group measured what's called collective intelligence. And it was the first time ever that you take a group of people and you measure the collective intelligence, the ability of those people to actually solve for tasks, intellectual tasks and intelligence-based tasks. And so they thought, maybe we're talking about the wrong things here, because in that collective intelligence, there was 3 main factors that defined a high-performing collective intelligent team. The first factor was social sensitivity. How sensitive were people to each other? Did they let everybody participate in the innovation and solving the problem? Were they supportive? Did they trust each other? The second factor was around the number of people actually communicating all the time throughout the process of solving problems. Did everybody contribute, or did 20% of the people dominate the conversation? And the third factor was how many females were actually in the group. So ladies, you're a part of the high-performing teams. And so when the Google people looked at this, they thought, we're looking at the wrong stuff. So they went back through those 2 years of data, and they found that when they correlated sort of these factors, psychological safety was the #1 predictor for a high-performance team, which was shocking. So psychological safety means, do you feel safe? Or do you feel safe sharing ideas that might not have been fully thought out? Do you feel like you're under the microscope, or do you feel like you can freely share and nobody's going to criticize your ideas? And so that led to these 5 sort of things that led to a high-performance team. Are you dependable? Obviously, that's pretty straightforward. The structure and clarity of the individuals understanding the job expectations and fulfilling those expectations. Meaning, finding a sense of purpose in either the work itself or the output is important for team effectiveness, right? Gets back to Simon Sinek, why we go to work. Do we feel inspired? Do we feel fulfilled at the end of the day? And the last thing was, do I have impact? Do I have impact to the outcomes of the company? By the way, we will be sharing a lot of the slides after the conference today, so if you want to read some of these, they're easy to read, they're pretty straightforward, if you want to read for yourself. And as we look at open source, and Paul talked a lot about this already, but open source, we're talking meritocracy, we're talking open sharing, best idea wins, we're talking about transparency and openness. So think of open source in the culture as really one of those ideas or one of those targets for the culture within your organization. I know in Canada, we believe in this wholeheartedly. We have a collaborative Slack channel for public sector. If you want to join the public sector Slack channel where you can talk about Red Hat products and services and solutions, and we have that open to a lot of public sector people right across this fine nation. We do a lot of meetups, user groups. We have a lot of HR policies sort of reflecting those values that we have with the company. And we have an open source policy. One example of this is the BC Dev Exchange out in province of British Columbia. They actually share their code where it makes sense into the open source community, and they harness the power of the 33 million people actively involved in the open source community to help drive innovation. What they've actually seen the patterns, various ministries within the government of BC will actually look at the source code repository, take that code and use it for different purposes. It's created a tremendous amount of collaboration and sharing, and we're starting to see that go right across the country with the other provinces too. So shared problems are solved faster. I've talked about that. Open standards preserve business agility, keep things open, and engagement in communities. Another source of information, a book written by Jim Whitehurst, who is our president and CEO of the company. The Open Organization is an excellent read. It's an easy read, and it talks about a conventional organization from a top-down perspective, the traditional command control versus organization and how that operates versus the open organization. Our organization is based on open source principles. So at the bottom, you have motivating, inspiring. You know, a lot of us can show up to work. You know, as leaders, we cannot force people to be passionate about what they do. We can pay them and we can motivate them that way, but we need to create a source of passion within the organizations through motivation and inspiration. And that's around purpose and passion. That's why we allow our engineers to work in the open source communities to drive innovation. We let meritocracy, we let ideas form, and we make decisions on how the company operates at the lowest levels within the company. And really, at the end of the day, all the leadership within our organization is catalyzing and including inclusive decision making. That's what we're talking about. The general mentioned in his team of teams, look, the leadership at the end of the day is like a gardener. We're trying to allow everything to grow within the organization by feeding it what it needs to be successful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about people. I think if you look at, a lot of people are struggling to find talent for their organizations. I was at the DevOps Day TO conference, 2 or 3 weeks ago here in Toronto, and I was surprised. I saw Capital One there. I saw a loyalty group. I saw non-traditional like IT companies sponsoring the event. And every company that sponsored the event got up on stage, and when they did their 2 or 3 minute sales pitch of their company, every one of them said, look, we're hiring DevOps people. And so people are struggling finding people. Using open source as kind of that mechanism for deciding on the type of people you hire or look for within the marketplace can be a strategic advantage to you. And let's face it, as Gartner says, 95% of IT organizations have open source within their environments, whether they know it or not. But looking at how open source works, you naturally form a culture of innovation, right, based on the open source principles. And so some organizations, such as the BC Dev Exchange I just mentioned, they're building their own communities using an open source format. And so that can help drive a cultural change within your organization. Using open source as a talent solution. So this FedTech document here that I referenced can help you understand how do I use open source to drive knowledge and skill gap between the teams. You know, I have a vision of one day organizations automating their entire organization using one sort of language for doing that. That will really bridge the teams within our organizations to allow automation to happen. So someone that does network administration or is an application developer, they speak the same automation language, bringing teams together. So from a process perspective, I've talked a lot about DevOps already in the process, but I want to focus on something that clients have asked us to do. When we did our CIO event where we asked all our top clients, you know, what is the one thing that Red Hat could bring to the table to help you? And the response was, show us how open source works, show us how you innovate. And we ended up actually building an offering called the Open Innovation Labs, which we've been doing a lot of within Canada. This is like a 2-4-week residency. We pair up guys that come from the Silicon Valley, have never heard the term waterfall. These are developers. We pair them up with your developers, and we go through a 2-4-week residency where we actually do a minimal viable product that brings value to the company. But really what's going on under the covers is also a cultural transformation change. Using agile-based practices, getting the team together to work on how do we work in a DevOps fashion. And I can remember we did one here actually in Toronto when the engagement was over. One of the ladies said, yeah, I would have left the organization if we hadn't done this. They were a traditional waterfall-based organization, and she actually had tears in her eyes because she knew she had to finish the residency and go back to her old job, if you will, in old ways. But they're continuing to drive this within the organization moving forward, so I'm sure she's happy. One of the critical aspects when we look at changing culture is you sometimes have to pull people outside of the normal organization into their own innovative space. That's something that a lot of the large financial institutions learned down in the US at the beginning. You need to pull people out of that culture, have your own culture, and forget that institutional memory, create a safe working environment, create a high trust environment. So through this residency, we pull people off site into really cool sort of new age DevOps kind of environments. So in closing, today, if anything I hammered to you in terms of messages, we need to create a trust, safe culture. We want to work in safe environments, and culture is a key aspect, if not the most important aspect, in creating a high-performance team. Consider the Open Innovation Lab for transforming your culture. Come see me today if you want to have a conversation. Usually I have one of those topics, takes me 2 or 3 hours to present, but I try to jam that into 45 minutes. Reach out to me on social media if you like. The slides will be shared. And I know we're videoing today, so if there's something I touched on that you didn't quite get, subscribe to the Red Hat North YouTube channel, where we actually publicize all the videos from today's activity so that you can show, you can look at it yourself, or you can show it to people within your organization. And with that, I thank you.